When it's go. Okay, great. Good day, everybody, and welcome to TRB AMF 50 Economic Development and Land Use 2023 November webinar. Today's topic is electrification in transportation, a timely topic that we'll for sure revisit from time to time when the technology evolves and depending on how economic development correlates with all the changes that's coming up. Our committee chairs, Professor Noreen McDonald and Michael Lawrence. The webinar is moderated by Professor Guang Tian and myself, Kate Ko. Our committee scope focuses on the impact of transportation on the economy, environment, and society. It's concerned with efficient, effective, and equitable transportation systems that promote competitive advantage, economic resiliency, and sustainability for our cities, regions, and societies. This committee provides a cross-cutting forum for practitioners and researchers to understand the interrelationship between transportation, economic development, and the economy, land use, and the policies and management approaches required to create sustainable growth at national, regional, and local scales. Okay. To join our future events and webinar, please go to mytrb.org. And from there, you can go to committees and click on being a friend of a committee and find AMS 50 and become a friend. So that's how you get engaged with our committee and other TRB activities. Back to this webinar. If you have questions, please type in your questions in the chat, or you can raise your hand virtually and we will unmute you and you can ask questions. Just a reminder that we have a TRB AMS 50 YouTube channel, and there you can find all our previous recordings, including our last one that happened in June, and that's transportation and property values. It's easy. You can just search Google YouTube and type in TRB and AMS 50. All right, so turn to our presentation for today. We have Gregory Carlton, and he will be presenting the paper on electric vehicles, charging station accessibility, and land use clustering, a study of the Chicago region. Gregory is a dedicated and accomplished doctoral candidate in geography at the University of North Carolina at Greensboro. With a passion for understanding emerging transportation paradigm shifts, his research focuses on the crucial aspects of equity and accessibilities within these evolving systems. In addition to his academic work, Gregory also works on as a transportation planner for the city of Greensboro, North Carolina, where he applies his latest science and research on transportation to help improve the lives of the city's residents. Gregory, turning it over to you.
Thank you so much, Kate. And thank you to the AMS 50 committee for hosting this great event. I am really happy to be here today to share my paper, Electric Vehicle Charging Station Accessibility and Land Use Clustering. Hopefully everybody can see it okay. It looks like you can, based on what I can see here.
Greg, before you start, I think we keep the time, it's scheduled for 1 hour. For two presentations, we probably going to go like 20 minutes for each. And a quick question, maybe a couple quick questions after you, and then after both presentations, we will open up for discussion.
Oh, thank you so much, Guang. Thank you.
Thank you. Sure.
So just a little bit of a background about this paper here. I think it's fairly self-evident right now that transportation electrification has been progressing at a very accelerated pace in recent years. And pretty much everybody on the committee and probably everybody in the audience has noticed quite a few more EVs driving around than there used to be. So in 2022, we actually saw a major increase of sales from the previous kind of pandemic slump years. So we had an increase of 55% of EV sales in the United States. And close to 800,000 battery electric vehicles were sold during that time. And globally, we're also seeing a very large increase of EVs. So I just wanted to share this chart here with everybody, just so we can kind of place this transition that's going on within a global context. So on this chart, you'll see electric vehicle registrations represented by the bars, and then you'll also see the sales of EV shares in each country, which are represented by those points. So this comes from the IEA. And you can see that the US, which is on the very far right side of this chart, is still lagging behind the rest of the world when it comes to EV adoption and EV growth. But you can see that although our curve is probably a lot more shallow than some other developed economies, that our sales share is increasing to close to 10% now. And soon we'll probably see quite a few more EVs on the road. Oops, sorry. Okay. So what are the factors that are propelling this transportation electrification forward? And there are just so many of them. And some of the biggest ones I listed here, and that would, of course, be concerns about climate change. Social factors and networks are a really important one that's not often discussed. So, for instance, if somebody in your peer network is adopting an alternative fuel vehicle or an electric vehicle, you'll probably also be more likely to consider that as well for your own future adoption. Also things like personal ideologies and brand image. So obviously Tesla has kind of this more upscale brand image that it's fostered. And so a lot of younger people or more tech savvy people want to own a Tesla. So these are just some of the adoption factors that are really propelling forward this electrification boom that we're seeing right now. And here's some very, I'd say, kind of fundamental papers I cited here that are also inside the, this paper, if you see the physical version of it as well, if you want to read up on more of these. But also what's going on right now, and it's not discussed as frequently in a lot of the academic literature, is this alliance between the government and kind of industry actors. So to accelerate the mass adoption of EVs, we've seen government actors in recent years begin incentivizing through rebates and through, government funding programs, new charging stations, and also encouraging people to purchase EVs. But we've also seen mandates come out in recent years. So these mandates basically stipulate by a certain year, you will pretty much have to purchase an alternative fuel vehicle or an electric vehicle. So market actors have responded to this push at the federal and state level by increasing their production of electric vehicles. So many major manufacturers have committed to completely eliminating conventional fuel vehicles from their lineups. And that's really led by European manufacturers that you see listed here, like Mercedes, Volkswagen, and Volvo. But also companies like Chevy and Ford, and also Asian manufacturers like Toyota and Honda are also taking an approach where they're slowly and gradually phasing out their conventional fuel vehicles and replacing it with electric vehicles. And they're doing that while the federal government has also started to initiate very large and significant grant programs designed to put charging infrastructure and electric vehicle infrastructure across the entire United States. So two of the biggest ones being NEVI and CFI, and those are both kind of government-led initiatives. But while all this is going on, there's this EV equity problem. And this EV equity problem is something that has to be addressed as we move forward, or it's going to create some very serious challenges to this, to the future of transportation electrification and to the future of transportation mobility. So one of the big things here is this chicken or egg concept. And this is kind of how you introduce this EV equity framework overall. Is you start by thinking about it from a very basic and foundational level. So of course, EVs are generally recharged overnight. So most people who own an EV will charge it at night, in their garage or in their carport. And in the morning, it will be 100% charged, and they'll use it in their day-to-day life. And oftentimes they won't have to access any public charging. However, not everybody obviously has home-based charging solutions. So if you are a renter, you live in an apartment complex or a condominium complex, or you just live in housing that doesn't have a garage or a carport, you will not be able to charge your vehicle overnight. So for mass adoption to be successful, you need to make sure you have a lot of public charging as well throughout a variety of different communities, and not just communities that are more affluent. You need it across all different socioeconomic backgrounds and different land use regimes, rural areas, urban areas, suburban areas, or else people who don't have access to overnight charging are going to have a very hard time reaching this technology in order to charge their vehicle. So of course, the big issue here is that public charging installation is expensive. I mean, it can cost thousands of dollars, if not more, depending on what kind of charging it is. And so because of this, planners and policymakers are presented with this chicken or the egg problem. So does the mass adoption come first? Do you focus your efforts on, ensuring that consumers right now who own an EV have access to charging, and then later on you deal with the lower income communities who may not right now have EV charging need? Or do you focus on providing charging to those lower income communities first, and then you build that charging infrastructure so that eventually they can own an EV? So it's a different way of looking at it. So right now, another thing that's been happening is that in the US, the primary EV charging placement method has been destination-based. So this means that charging is often at commercial destinations, so at a movie theater or a shopping mall, or maybe at a upscale grocery store. And basically, those different businesses are using electric vehicles to lure in customers. So they figure that if somebody needs to charge their vehicle, they'll go shopping at that commercial venue while their vehicle is outside charging. And that way they get, kind of an additional group of business that they may not have gotten previously. And then the person who needs to charge their vehicle also has access to some services and amenities. But this vision of charging is very different from the placement priorities of state actors who are more concerned about access, equity, and different policy initiatives, because this kind of charging is very market driven. It's driven by businesses and private corporations and not necessarily by state planners. So if market actors are the ones following this profit-driven model and they're the ones primarily charging electric vehicles, what could be happening is a clustering of charging around certain higher income destinations at the expense of working class communities. So what this means is that, in a situation where we replace conventional fuel vehicles, meaning vehicles that run on gas or diesel, one-to-one with electric vehicles, it should be an ideal system. Everybody should have the same level of access to refueling that they have right now. However, if all that charging infrastructure isn't being spaced out properly and it's not being placed in a variety of different communities, then it's probably going to end up congregating around certain higher income destinations. And that's going to make it more difficult for people who maybe wouldn't traditionally shop at one of those destinations to refuel their vehicle, because then they would be, of course, forced to drive 20 or 30 minutes out of their way to go to a shopping mall to recharge their vehicle, when it would be much easier for them to charge it somewhere close to their home or in their community. So despite these concerns I just listed here, there is a wide variety of people who have looked at land use, but they haven't really looked at it yet from this perspective of equity. And that's really what this Chicago case study hones in on. So in this case study, we posed the following questions, and that is, do charging stations agglomerate around certain land use regimes? And are charging stations balanced in their spatial distribution, meaning, it's not, only concentrated in certain parts of the city, but in multiple parts of the city? And then, do clustered EV charging developments have an impact on accessibility? So does this impact, people being able to reach refueling within a reasonable amount of time? And we chose the Chicago area for our case study because the Chicago area traditionally has this kind of north-south axis of development, where the north side of the city and the suburbs have generally more access to opportunities than the south side of the city and its south suburbs. And so that made it very interesting to look at for EV charging. And this is taken from a paper here by Armagan and Tilawan. And you can just see here some access disparities. You can see that if you look in the southern part of the city here, you'll see this red color is represented across all these different opportunity types: jobs, groceries, parks. So this indicates that those areas have less accessibility than some of the areas to the north and west of the city. And this is also reflected out onto a metropolitan scale. So once you leave the city boundary and look at the suburbs as well, you'll see areas to the south and west generally have higher level of burden when it comes to accessibility and equity issues than areas along the lake shore to the north of Chicago or to the far northwest of the city. So in order to analyze our research questions, we downloaded charging station data from the Alternatives Field Data Center, which is a government source of charging station location data. And we clipped those stations to be within the boundaries of the Chicago metropolitan region, including the parts of the metropolitan area in Indiana and Wisconsin. So there are a few small areas that are outside of Illinois as well, and those are often frequently neglected in studies. So we wanted to make sure we had the whole metro area represented. And for our units of analysis, we use community areas within the city of Chicago to kind of aggregate some of these clusters together and build some statistics. And these community areas are essentially neighborhoods. So these represent neighborhood boundaries. And then for outside of the city of Chicago, we use townships, and townships is a little different, way of aggregation than you may be used to with TASs and, census district boundaries. But they're relatively uniform in Chicago, and they have a pretty rectangular, kind of homogeneous shape, which makes them more easy to compare with each other. So what we did is we applied a clustering analysis algorithm here, which is DBSCAN. And what DBSCAN did is it looked at all the charging stations across the Chicago region. And it found areas where 4 or more stations were within 4,000 feet of each other, feet from kind of a Euclidean distance perspective there. And what it did is it formed clusters out of those stations. And you can see we chose 4,000 as that cutoff point based on a K nearest neighbor matrix approach. And you can see here on this elbow plot that I have in the bottom left, that you can kind of see that at 4,000 feet there is roughly where the majority of the points are represented. And then we applied a traditional cumulative accessibility opportunities metric to capture accessibility. But we, slightly augmented it to account for multiple possible origin points. So oftentimes accessibility analysis is done at the kind of the centroid of a aerial unit. But in this case, we made sure to, incorporate the fact that it's not just the centroid of these units that would have different, accessibility issues. It's the entire unit itself. So following that DBSCAN approach where we captured all these different charging clusters and we looked at accessibility, we use heuristic methods to then look at the surrounding land use around each one of those clusters. And we went into different GIS portals and we went through and we kind of cognitively grouped these different charging clusters together to see what's the predominant land use around there. So is it more commercial? Maybe it's more of a hospital district or a university. And we saw what is that prevailing land use, and we took note of that in order to use that for a more robust analysis. So now I want to share the results with you from this work. And I'm going to look at this from each one of those original research questions that I posed. So does charging cluster around certain land use regimes in the Chicago metro area? And the answer to that is yes, it does. So if you look here on this map, you'll see that these red points are the charging clustered stations. So these are stations that are part of a cluster. And those yellow boxes around them just kind of show you the boundary of that cluster. So in some cases, you had a lot more charging stations than others within the cluster. So those yellow boxes just helped kind of offset that visually. So you can see here that the DBSCAN algorithm located 34 areas of clustered charging with at least 4 charging stations within 4,000 feet of each other. And very interestingly, 73% of those clusters could be tied to a single land use. So for instance, an airport or a hospital or a university. And there wasn't much land use mixing around those charging stations. They pretty much serve a singular purpose. On the other hand, 26% of those clusters could be tied to more of a mixed use development where you see a lot of different kinds of development around the cluster, so not just a single unitary type. So I really want to hone in on commercial development. So about 52% of those charging clusters were found at isolated shopping malls. So you're all familiar with these if you live in North America. These are your big kind of on the outskirts suburban shopping malls with massive parking lots. They're a sea of asphalt for the most part. And these have very poor land use mixing and balance. So basically, it's just a shopping mall, maybe a couple office buildings, and that's it. There's no walkability. There's no, ability to really cycle here. Or sometimes there's not even good public transit access to these places. They're very car-centric locales. So some of these malls that had these commercial charging clusters around them were like Woodfield Mall, which used to be one of the largest malls in the United States. Oakbrook Center and Yorktown Center Mall, which are very upscale malls that have stores in them like Louis Vuitton and Prada. And then many smaller power centers. So your kind of typical strip malls with, your big box stores in them. And so often charging stations in these areas were also at upscale car dealerships. So there may be like an upscale car dealership right next to the mall, and some of the charging stations were actually at those locations as well. And so those, even if they are publicly available for people to use, there's a bit of a psychological barrier in order to get into those locations, just because, if you own a little Toyota, you may not feel comfortable charging it at a Mercedes dealer. But there was some good news out of this. So many of Chicago's older suburbs had clusters of charging that were really well integrated with the community. So these are charging stations that are surrounded by different services and amenities and not just a single kind of development. So people could ride transit while their vehicle's charging and maybe go do some errands. Maybe they could go eat at a different restaurant, or they could just walk home while their vehicle's charging and, get some tasks done, accomplish a few things, and then come back to their vehicle. So these locations fit better in with people's habitual daily routines than a charging station cluster that may be out at a mall, for instance. So that was our first question. Now, if we look at our second question, are charging stations balanced in their spatial distribution? And the answer to this one is no, they are not, at least not in Chicago area. So if you look at the map here, you'll see that pretty much all the charging clusters are to the north and the west of the city, the central business district of the city. And so that is represented here in this statistic that 73% of charging clusters were latitudinally even with or north of downtown Chicago or the central business district. There was actually only one charging cluster in the southern part of the city, and none were located in the south suburbs or northwest Indiana. That's quite staggering. So you can see that this imbalance is very profound, and it matches up very well with some of those other imbalances that I told you earlier about when it came to things like healthcare and education. There are also some unclustered charging stations represented here as the white points. Those are stations that were not found to be within a charging cluster. So there were not 4 of them within 4,000 feet of each other. So these also have a role to play in the region, and I'll talk about that when I talk about accessibility in a moment. So that axial disparity I told you there is very profound in Chicago. This is a very significant finding of this research, and it's that electric vehicle charging is being placed predominantly in more affluent communities. And since those EV charging stations are not a part of many of the lower income communities or working class communities, it means that people have to drive out of their way to charge their vehicle. So if you want to own an EV in a community that's traditionally disadvantaged, you may have a very difficult time finding public charging within that community. You may have to drive 20 or 30 minutes away to a shopping mall that you wouldn't normally go to otherwise just to charge your vehicle. And so what we can see here in Chicago is that the market actors seem to have placed the chicken before the egg. So they've been focusing more on the community of adopters that is higher income, and they've not been focusing on future communities of adopters who may be wanting to own an EV in 5 years from now or 10 years from now. And that leads directly into the final question here, and that is, do clustered EV charging developments have an impact on accessibility to EV charging? And the answer to this one is yes, and I'm going to dive a little deeper into this here on these next two slides. So first of all, I'm looking within the city of Chicago, so not including the suburbs. So within the city of Chicago, in those community areas or neighborhoods close to the Loop, which is downtown Chicago, there are a lot of charging stations that are available within 15 minutes of these particular neighborhoods. So on average, there are up to 461 charging outlets available within kind of the area surrounding downtown Chicago, as you can see here on this map on the right. And very fascinatingly, of these charging stations here, between 90 to 100% of them were part of a charging cluster. So this area is very dense. So you have a lot of charging clusters in here. And so these charging clusters are very, very prevalent in this part of Chicago. And most people who will charge their vehicle here at a public station will go to somewhere where there's multiple station options for them to choose from. Now, if you contrast this to the southwest side of Chicago and also the south side of Chicago, you see that many of those neighborhoods have less than 15 outlets available within 15 minutes. And in the very far south part of Chicago, which is, you can kind of see it here on the map, it's at the very southern periphery, there are 0 charging outlets available within 15 minutes. And so this is a very important finding of this work. It really demonstrates that axial disparity in charging placement is also a disparity in accessibility as well. Now, if we kind of zoom out and look at the whole Chicago metropolitan region and not just the city limits, this trend continues for the most part. So suburbs to the north and northwest of the city had between 88 and 144 charging outlets available on average within a 15-minute drive. And quite a few of these, once again, are part of those charging clusters at upscale malls and upscale shopping areas for the most part. Comparatively, in the south suburbs and northwest Indiana, there were far fewer charging outlets available. So a lot less accessibility in those locations. Maybe there's kind of between 5 to 15 charging outlets available in places like Gary, Indiana, or Homewood, Illinois. And 0% of that charging can be tied to clustered development. So all those charging outlets to the south and kind of south of Chicago and northwest Indiana, those charging outlets are not part of a cluster. They're just kind of dispersed throughout that area. There may be 1 or 2 here or there, but they're not part of a cluster. They're not clustered around a mall. They're not clustered around an airport or a university. They're just kind of, maybe at a gas station, or maybe they're at, a car dealership. So another interesting part of this is that rural areas on the far periphery also have a very low amount of charging, which is probably more of a function of density than it is anything else. So what are the implications and takeaways that we can take out of this research to help improve equity and help improve land use mix and balancing around EV charging stations? Well, first of all, our contention after reviewing these results is that underserved and traditionally disadvantaged communities to the south of Chicago and in Northwest Indiana need to be prioritized for EV charging by policymakers. So in the next presentation you'll hear in a minute, prioritization is one way that we can look at equity. And that's what we're advocating for. We're advocating that areas that don't have charging need it. And that's essential because in the future, there's going to be those mandates that are going to phase out conventional fuel vehicles. And we have to start planning for that inevitability for where people are going to need to purchase an EV if they don't have good access to transit. And if they're unable to have any charging in their community, then it's going to be very impractical for them to purchase that EV. And it's going to lead to a situation where they may not have access to all the opportunities that other people in different parts of the city have. And of course, this study also revealed that the way that EV charging is agglomerating is not sustainable from a land use perspective. So charging should be well woven into the fabric of the community and should present patrons with an ability to conduct their habitual daily travel behaviors without having to travel great distances to charge their vehicles. And then there's also a psychological barrier to that as well. If you're having to drive out of your community 20 minutes away, 30 minutes away to a shopping mall that has, a Louis Vuitton store in it, or a Gucci store in it, and that's not the kind of place you would normally shop, there's this element of feeling out of place when you have to go to a community like that. And people shouldn't have to do that just to refuel their vehicle. And so that's an aspect of equity that also needs to be further investigated. And a lot has changed since we published this paper 2 years ago, roughly 2 years ago. So the state legislature of Illinois has passed a new law that mandates that new housing developments need to install EV charging. And that's really excellent. And we've also seen the promulgation of the Justice 40 initiative at the federal level, which means that 40% of new investments in EV infrastructure should go towards those disadvantaged communities. So we've seen some really positive steps coming up here that maybe will shift some of the way that EV allocation has been done recently. However, we understand that equity is something that has to be done on a continuous spectrum. You have to keep looking at how EV charging stations are being placed to ensure that these equity disparities don't get any worse and to help lessen the gap. So that's really what we're advocating for. And if you'd like to read our full paper on this, you can follow this QR code. It's an open access paper at the Journal of Urban Mobility. And we invite people to please read this paper if they'd like to. And that will end my, my portion of the presentation. Thank you very much.
Okay. Great. Thanks, Gregory. Just looking at the time, let's have Dr. Sultana present, and then we can do questions and answer together afterwards. So next up, we have Dr. Sultana. Please pull up your presentation when you get the chance. Dr. Sultana will be presenting transport equity considerations in electric vehicles charging research, a scoping review. Dr. Salima Sultana is a professor in the Department of Geography, Environment, and Sustainability at UNC Greensboro and a recipient of the 2021 Edward Ullman Award from the American Association of Geographers, Transportation Geography Special Group. That's a really long name, for her significant contribution to the field of transport geography. She's also a recipient of the 2019 Southeastern Division of Association of American Geographers Research Honors Awards for her outstanding research and leadership in the field of geography. In addition to authoring a book on transportation modes across the world, she has published numerous journal articles, book chapters, and research reports. Her co-authored book entitled "The Parks Belong to the People: The Geography of National Park System" will be published in early 2024 by the University of Georgia Press. Dr. Sultana?
Thank you very much for that nice introduction, and thank you very much for inviting us to give this presentation. I'm sorry at first that recently we actually migrated from Zoom to another system and we're having issues with the Zoom, and so I apologize for that. So this part of the presentation actually will look into transport equity consideration in EV charging research. So this is a scuba review, not like, you saw all those maps and empirical evidence, but this is based on whatever outside that research has been done over the years on equity in EV charging, and that's what we will be focusing. Given the time limit, I didn't realize that we have a very kind of 10 minutes probably. If I look at it, I make sure how much time I have, okay?
I think you have to enter the full screen, doctors.
Let's have the full screen. Where should I? Okay.
It's showing your notes and stuff.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
So can you tell me exactly where I should?
I don't know. Somebody.
Okay.
Do you have two screens?
I have three screen actually in my
Yeah, it's
computer.
probably,
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah. So,
You may
so
want to share the screen, you know, where the PowerPoint is full.
Now you see?
Like like what we say is the screen that was load. You probably want to
Okay.
share the screen with presentation. Yeah, you can stop sharing and then resharing to choose the screen where your PowerPoint is showing as a full.
Okay. Does it work now?
Yes, it does.
Yes.
Okay. Thank you. Well, can you see entire presentation? Because I'm also kind of using laptop and other thing. Okay, so I think Greg introduced almost some of the literature that, you know, equity is a big concern in EV adoption and EV infrastructure development. So I would not go through any kind of background since you already actually heard from Greg's part of the presentation. So I'll just move to the directly that what we have actually focused in this paper. So those are most of it. How transportation equity has been addressed so far in the EV charging or EV adoption research areas. So, you know, while there is a literature and, you know, huge conversation is going on, especially we have heard during the you know, our bipartisan bill adoption, that equity has been a big topic, and there has been a lot of webinar has been conducted throughout the year, and that how we can have more equity in EV adoption, because this is a time for a transportation paradigm shift, and all those previous paradigm shift that has been happening, there was always equity issues, but this time there was a strong vocal a concern was expressed that make sure that this paradigm shift address the equity concern. Well, but when we look at, first of all, that even though we talk this topic, equity justice often, this topic is extremely complex and there is no agreement. So we actually look at that what way we have been thinking so far about the equity concept in the EV adoption process or EV charging infrastructure implementation. So there are actually ambiguity in that research, but if you really want to know all the detail about that, you know, what kind of concept of equity actually exists, I would recommend, I'm not going to touch that, Perry et al. 2017 has a very elaborate discussion about every aspect, philosophical aspect of the equity, that including utilitarian, libertarianism, institutionalism, and egalitarianism and capabilities approaches. So in our but this topic is also kind of, equity is also kind of very complex. Recently, you also heard the actually justice, transportation justice. We did talk about equity for a while, for a long time, and nowadays we have been using the term often that equity. So recent article Garner actually kind of divided, differentiated that what is different between transportation equity and actually transportation justice, and her approach is more of a justice is more often that approach take more of an activist approach than it's more equity is more practiced by the planners or academic use that topic as well. So when it comes, we actually look at the review process. That so here we mostly use Prisma SCR, search protocol, that we wanted to identify knowledge gaps, explore the overall body of literature, locating, relating to the EV, transportation equity and EV charging. And these are the research questions we actually asked. What role does EV charging play in promoting or hindering social and transportation equity? What insights about charging equity can be gleaned from both explicit and implicit discussion of charging equity? How are transportation equity philosophies applied in the context of EV charging research? So we looked at the eligibility criteria. And in that case, we looked at the paper that has actually mentioned the explicit way of equity, the term equity language through the on the other hand, we also look at the implicit article that did talk about distributional aspect, but they never actually the differences between distribution, geographic distribution, or social distribution, socioeconomic areas, but not really use the term equity. So charging equity research, based on that, we actually use those terms, and here are those graphs. You will see when we use the word, two of the philosophy, we actually look at distributional philosophies and utilitarian approaches. So implicit equity and explicit equity we have looked at. And when we use the utilitarian approaches, is more of a social welfare. So so looking into that, we looked at multiple queries were conducted using a combination of search term. And here you will see that, how articles are selected. It was a choose word. But ultimately, what we found in the results, actually the 37 peer-reviewed articles were located that use implicit or explicit approaches to study EV charging equity. Studies mentioning distributional equity issues and EV charging has grown tremendously, especially since 2015. And 75%, almost 76% of the article were written in the last 3 years. So you can look at in this graph that, what kind of research we have actually looked into and where implicit equity has been used. On the other hand, we found that though not a primary, let's go back a little bit. On the other hand, we actually found that only 29, with almost like 30% of the articles used explicit equity terms. And most of these articles originate from North American context. So equity is more prevalent in the conversation we're talking in North American context. Though not a primary focus of this review, the number of utilitarian articles related to charging placement is much higher, 62 of them actually, that discussed about distributional approaches. So distributional approaches are very common theme throughout the literature. On the other hand, utilitarianism remains the dominant research paradigm within the charging equity. Among articles expressing explicit equity consideration, simple equality and prioritization perspective are the most prevalent, representing 4 articles, each from equally roles, egalitarian, and sufficientism perspective are each found in 1 article. The implicit article found in this research generally present a viewpoint of how EV charging equity does or could function without suggesting how it ought to function. In this way, implicit equity articles could be considered morally neutral. On the other hand, the majority of implicit related EV charging equity articles focus on distributional gaps using techniques such as regression to imply causal relationship between charging and socioeconomic variables. Corroboration of homeowners' renter gap in charging access is very implicitly actually mentioned in the article. Other finding differences like concern about public charging availability between current EV owners and non-owners, and among them actually the installation and densification of charging is important for adoption. On the other hand, the willingness to pay for charging may be a function of age, income, and mobility. So how much they're willing to pay, that also kind of socioeconomic variability we can actually see in the literature. Multiple authors suggest that EV charging resource should be prioritized to traditionally disadvantaged communities, but even though it is not explicit in nature, many and people looked at the distributional, but they did actually mention that we should invest more to the traditionally disadvantaged communities. Other concludes that lower adoption communities need more investment in the other modes of transit and transport, which will make a greater difference than EV charging. So there is a debate on that when it comes to the EV adoption. Most express a simple approach to equity, expressing a need for more charging without necessarily prioritizing one group over others. So finally, I would have the discussion and a little bit of reflection that more is specific. It is, however, it is encouraging. Ultimately, the bottom line is that it is encouraging that researchers have started this conversation. More specific and deliberate consideration of transportation equity and justice from multiple methodological and geographic contexts would likely provide value to researchers and practitioners. And I think that is the future direction of research. This review also raised interesting question about formation and knowledge. While research focused distributional EV charging equity, a number of new and innovative equity approaches exist that have yet to be applied to EV charging station planning. And I think that research has been going to take in the future direction. Other thing I would also say that methods of equity appraisal, such as socially relevant accessible impact approach, or Lucas et al., or the capabilities approach of Shane or Nussbaum, have also emerged and should be considered in EV research. So those are our bottom line findings, but from the paper. But at the same time that Greg have been involved in this process. I'm his supervisor, and in this process is looking at multiple dimension of equity in EV charging station, and it is you can look forward to seeing that in near future. Thank you very much for these opportunities.
Well, thank you, Dr. Sultana. We have time for questions and answers. I know Guang usually have the first question, so don't want to put you on the spot, but I know you probably have one.
Yeah, I do have a couple. The first, Greg, I have. Well, it's not like a question; it's more like clarification. Is about like a couple of them. The first, like when you talk about the stations, are there like one station has like multiple chargers or outlets, or are they like one station? You mean one
Yeah.
outlet?
Yeah, that's a very good point. And so when I'm referring to a station, I'm referring to actually an outlet. So I would call this like a charging opportunity. So those clusters are actually more of clusters of outlets than they are individual stations. So there may be 2 or 3 different outlets around a charging station, and that could form a cluster as well. So that way it takes into account that you may have a place that has, you know, 8, 12, outlets next to each other, for instance, and that would be almost like a cluster as well. So
Right. Yeah. That's good because like I'm thinking maybe in the downtown, right? Like they may have, if you see a station, maybe they are vary with how many chargers or outlets they
yeah.
have, but you are using the outlets. That's great. So the other one is, I'm having. It's like, are those charger stations are like you are considering like or like public or private or like all of them or included?
Yeah, so all right, so those are all from the AFDC database. So in theory, those should all be public charging stations. I say that in theory because as you know, with many, large data sets, sometimes some stations that may or may not fully be public could end up in there, perhaps erroneously. But for the most part, they're supposed to be public. And in fact, the Department of Energy and the US DOT is actually using that AFDC charging database right now in order to help fund some new grant opportunities for charging stations. As part of that, they have to be public charging stations. So that database is supposed to be all public, but like I mentioned, there are some that I would call semi-private, where it's like it's at a hotel. Like you can go to that hotel and charge your vehicle, but since you're not staying at the hotel, there's this bit of a attention to it too, as well.
Right. Yeah. That's because right. Like you were talking about, like equity related. If if we want to address those issues, right, those have to be, those stations are open to everyone, right? If it's private, even there are maybe a lot, but people don't have access. It doesn't count. Yeah. Thank you for that. Well, for I have one question for Dr. Santana. It's more a technical question. It's not about the paper itself. Like
Okay,
I mentioned
sure.
there, yeah, it's just about the.
Yeah, I really had to make it 30 minutes presentation. I had to make it 10 minutes. Okay.
Right. Yeah. Like how do you find those implicit articles, right? Like you said, like implicit, like they don't mention that equity or
Exactly.
just in words, right? Like when you do the literature search, like how you find those articles.
Okay, that was, I think, that was as a procedure actually.
Yeah,
that you
so
can, go.
Yeah, not to jump in on you, Dr. Sultana.
Okay.
Yeah, do you have the slide with the
Yes, I
search
do.
protocol on it?
Yes, I do. I really had to go very, very quickly. Okay, but I can share this. And this is also kind of very messy too.
Yeah. Let's see.
Can you see
Okay,
it?
so if you look
Mhm.
here, Guang, you'll see that we actually have different search terms. So we did 3 different searches. So we had our initial query, which uses more of those explicit terms, like you would think equity, justice, or disparity. Those are words that have a real coded equity language. And then we did 2 more searches after that. After reviewing the initial group of searches, we realized that there's some other words that, may be more of this implicit kind of equity. So we did this search for accessibility, which you see that middle search protocol. And then on the far right side, we also had income, race, ethnicity, which are also often words that are used to demonstrate those distributional differences, for instance, between one group of people or another. but they may not actually say, equity in that, or they may not call it a disparity. They just say there's a difference between income, these two income groups. So that's how we, managed to come up with also some of those implicit articles.
Okay.
But there is, some of the paper is basically they do not use, if you use equity, you really have to use the concept of equity. So some author kind of avoid that. Instead of using equity, they would just say, geographically it varies, or there is, lack of such in low income areas or rural areas.
That's my questions. That everyone can ask question now.
I think we can maybe try to answer this question real quick from the audience, from Elcar. Can you elaborate on how curbside charging plays into the equity question?
That is very interesting. I really had to go. That is the area that the future, I think I had to go so fast that is the area that future research will take place. This is one of the area we identified that's where future, because now kind of I have seen that some of the places kind of is taking place because they're creating sidewalk in the road. They're creating a space where they're putting the charging station so people can park there on the street, and then there is a charging station. Right. Okay, so that is kind of taking over. So those are new phenomena. Not many people talked about it, right, but that is something new that people will be talking in the near future.
And there's actually a good paper on this by Henderson, 2020. It's in the Annals of the Association of American Geographers. And that's one of the few papers that's actually looked at that curb space issue from an equity perspective and what it may mean if you're turning, like Dr. Sultana said, if you're turning biped and sidewalk, infrastructure, transit, transit lane into EV charging, and how that could be very detrimental. So that's a very good article if you have a chance to read that one.
Just a related follow-up, if for those maybe who had time, it's related because we see those curbside charging in Asia or in Europe, just not quite here yet. Anything else we can learn from international experience, especially from countries much more advanced in deploying EV and adopting EV?
Yeah, a number of my other students are working on the EV adoption. And one of the things that it has been talked, but at the same time, we also, this is also in the process of preparation of manuscript. And we found that early adopters, especially at this moment, that the EV rebate we are giving, that is really not matters for the early adopters. They took advantage of it, but they are not. But the EV rebates, it's really, really important for the maybe people who will be adopting in kind of like next 2-3 years, when EV price will go down, more of a higher middle income people are going to start adopting it. And I think that would be, they really care with, but that by then, whether, if rebate is not available, maybe that may slow down the EV adoption. So that's one thing I would say that's a very new something we found from our survey analysis. So other thing I can also tell you that charging station, similarly from this very survey, it hasn't been published yet, but we will in the process of writing it. And survey actually suggested that only people, middle income people who are willing to adopt the EV but hasn't been adopted yet, they are the one who really care for the proximity to the EV charging station. On the other hand, people who already have EV, they basically don't have much of concern. Mostly they do have a charging station at home, and also I believe that their needs are met because currently our EV charging infrastructure is very heavily focused on corridor based.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to see that study because I heard a lot. It seems there are big concerns about charging, right? If people hesitate of buying EV cars, that the charging is one of the most important factor. But I look forward to see your study come out. You can read that.
Well, there is other thing the future research can be done, that there are a lot of EV charging stations, but they don't work. Something present there. So that is another thing. We need data. There are other data. So more. I think that as EV infrastructure investment goes, all kind of investment is going in North Carolina right now. Is EV battery will be produced. There are a couple of companies. They are going to plant EV. They are going to assemble EV car. So I think it's lots going to happen in North Carolina. Yeah.
Okay. Is there any more questions? No. Yeah. Thank you two very much. I think we are up to our time. This will be recorded and uploaded to our YouTube video channel. For people who couldn't attend, they can watch that. And thank you both. And I think it's a fantastic presentation. I've learned a lot on this.
Yeah. Thank you for inviting us. I really appreciate giving us
thank you
opportunity
so much.
to
Thank
talk
you,
about our
everybody.
research.
Yeah.
See you next time.
See you.